Picture yourself standing in a great hall where the air hangs thick with smoke and the smell of roasting meat you can't quite identify. The trestle tables stretch before you, groaning under the weight of dishes that would make a modern health inspector weep or possibly faint. A swan redressed in its own feathers after roasting sits at the centre like it might take flight. Beside it, a pie the size of a wagon wheel conceals something alive inside rustling and cooing. You're not in a fever dream. You're at dinner in the Middle Ages and you probably won't survive the next course with your stomach or your sanity intact. Tonight we're diving fork first into the meal's history tried to bury. Not the sanitised feasts you see in costume dramas where everyone nibbles daintily on roast chicken and grapes. No, we're talking about the strange, the forgotten, the downright bewildering foods that fueled medieval Europe. The dishes that made sense to them but sound like madness to us. The ingredients that were everywhere then and nowhere now. The meals that straddled the line between feast and theatre, between sustenance and spectacle. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love knowing this strange little community is scattered across time zones, all settling in for the same peculiar journey through the past. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The medieval table was a place of contradictions. Abundance sat beside scarcity. Opulence masked desperation. A noble might dine on gilded peacock while a peasant gnawed yesterday's bread soaked in onion water, and both believed they were eating exactly what God intended for their station. Food wasn't just fuel. It was law, identity, theatre medicine, and prayer all rolled into one. Walk into any medieval kitchen, noble or common, and the first thing that hits you is the smell. Smoke always smoke from fires that never fully die. Underneath that, the funk of fermentation ale, brewing in corners, cabbage turning to sauerkraut in crocks, fish hanging in the rafters slowly becoming something else entirely. There's rendered fat herbal bitterness, the iron tang of blood puddled on the chopping block. Your modern nose would rebel. Theirs didn't even notice. The second thing you'd notice nothing is wasted. The pig's head becomes brawn, its trotters jelly, its bladder a ball for children or a container for lard. The blood thickens into sausage. Even the squeal people joked found a use. This wasn't sentimentality, it was survival math. When your pig took 6 months to fatten, and might be the only one you slaughter all year, every part had to count. But here's where it gets strange. Waste not, want not pushed medieval cooks toward ingredients we'd never consider. Organ meats, obviously liver, kidney, lungs, heart, all regular fare, but also things that make you pause coxcombs and chicken feet simmered for their gelatin. Calf's brains whipped into a paste, marrow sucked from bones like candy. The boundary between food and animal part didn't exist the way it does now. And then there were the creatures themselves. You think you know medieval protein, beef, pork, chicken, fish. You're not wrong, but you're not right either. Yes, those anchored the diet. But wander into the wrong or right feast and you'd encounter swans, herons, egrets, cranes. You'd find porpoises classified as fish so monks could eat them on Fridays. You'd see dormice fattened in jars, hedgehogs wrapped in clay whale meat, sold in coastal markets like it was codfish. Historians still argue whether these exotic meats were everyday fare or special occasion flex. The truth probably lives somewhere in between. A peasant might taste swan once in their life at a lord's wedding feast where scraps were distributed. A coastal monk might genuinely prefer porpoise to herring, not as spectacle, but as Tuesday. Context was everything. What unified all these meals, strange and familiar alike, was a worldview we've lost. Medieval diners didn't see food as we do as nutrients, calories, ethical choices. They saw it through the lens of humoral theory, a medical framework inherited from ancient Greece. Every food was hot or cold, wet or dry. Eating wasn't just about filling your belly. It was about balancing your body's inner weather, aligning yourself with the cosmos, keeping illness at bay. A fish, cold and wet, might dangerously tip your humours if you were already phlegmatic. The solution: drown it in hot, dry spices, ginger, pepper, cinnamon. Not for flavour alone, though flavour mattered. For health, for survival. The medieval cook was part chemist, part priest, part physician, stirring not just pots, but destinies. And so tonight we'll walk through that world bite by bite. We'll meet the meals that defined an age then vanished. The dishes that sound like pranks but were served with utmost seriousness. The ingredients that were everywhere then and would get you arrested at a farmer's market now. We'll taste in memory what they tasted. We'll understand maybe why they ate what they ate. The great hall awaits. The fire crackles. The first course is coming. You're seated at a lord's high table, and the servants process in like they're carrying the crown jewels. Except they're not. They're carrying a bird. But not just any bird, a peacock fully refeathered, its iridescent tail fanned behind it. In a shimmering cascade of blues and greens, its head held high, as if it still lives. For a moment you almost believe it does. The beak gleams with gold leaf. The eyes-glass, now not living, catch the torchlight. It processes past you on a silver platter, and the entire hall holds its breath. This is the peacock redux. One of the most labour-intensive, absurd, magnificent dishes the medieval kitchen ever produced. And yes, people actually ate it. Here's how it worked. First you killed the peacock, already a statement since peacocks were expensive, ornamental, and frankly, not that delicious. The meat is lean to the point of dryness, gamey tough. But taste was never the point. This was theatre. This was power made edible. The cook's job began with careful skinning. You couldn't just pluck the bird like a chicken. You had to remove the entire hide feathers still attached in one intact piece. Imagine peeling off a delicate jewelled coat without tearing a single thread. One slip and the whole display was ruined. The best cooks developed techniques, cutting along the spine, working the skin free with a thin blade, and patient fingers leaving the plumage perfect. Once skinned, the naked bird was roasted on a spit, usually stuffed with expensive spices, to mask the inherent dryness of the meat. Some cooks wrapped it in fat from other animals, bacon, lard, anything to keep it moist. Others basted it constantly with butter and wine. Meanwhile, the skin and feathers were carefully preserved, sometimes rubbed with oils to keep the plumage glossy. Here's where it gets weird. After roasting, the cook redressed the peacock in its own skin, stitching, pinning, arranging every feather back into place so the final presentation looked alive. The tail was fanned and propped with hidden wires or wooden supports. The head was raised sometimes with a stick inserted through the neck. The feet were positioned just so. Gold leaf was applied to the beak and sometimes the feet. Because if you're going this far, why not? Some kitchens took it even further. They'd stuff the peacock's throat with camphor-soaked cloth and set it alight just before serving, so the bird entered the hall breathing fire. Imagine it, this seemingly living creature, gorgeous and terrible flames, licking from its beak carried by solemn servants while musicians played. The modern mind struggles to categorize it. Dinner, art installation, religious rite. All three, probably. Historians still argue whether the fire-breathing peacock was common or a once-in-a-reign spectacle. Records mention it, but not frequently. It's possible that most peacock dishes skipped the pyrotechnics and stuck with the refeathering alone, which was already several hours of work. Either way, the message was clear: whoever ordered this meal had resources to burn, sometimes literally. And who actually ate this marvel? Here's the thing, probably not many people and not much of it. The peacock sat at the high table, often carved by the Lord himself in a ceremonial display. Choice portions went to the most honoured guests. The rest. Well, by the time you'd skinned, roasted, redressed, paraded and carved a peacock, the meat was cold dry and not particularly appetising. Lower tables got scraps if anything. Dogs got the rest. The point was never the eating, it was the seeing. This wasn't unique to peacocks. Swans got similar treatment, roasted, redressed, gilded. So did herons, which were even less tasty but equally impressive. The medieval feast operated on a logic we've mostly lost, that food could be sculpture, that a meal could be a message written in flesh and feathers, that what you displayed mattered more than what you digested. But let's not pretend this was all empty show. These dishes existed in a world where visual literacy mattered more than written literacy for most people. A refeathered peacock didn't just say, "I'm rich." It invoked specific symbolism, immortality, pride, the resurrection, since peacock flesh was rumoured not to decay. It connected the feast to biblical imagery, classical mythology, heraldic tradition. It transformed a dinner into a text that everyone present could read, even if they couldn't read Latin or French. The cooks who created these dishes were artists, no question. They needed the skills of a taxidermist, a sculptor, a painter, a roaster, and a diplomat, because if the peacock's tail drooped, or the gold leaf flaked, or the meat was inedibly charred, someone's head might roll. Metaphorically. Probably. You sit there watching this absurd bird pass by, and part of you wants to laugh. Part of you is genuinely awed. Part of you wonders what the actual peacock would think if it could see itself now stripped, stuffed, gilded, worshipped, and finally carved into oblivion. And part of you, the hungry part, just wishes they'd brought out the roast pork instead. Because here's the secret everyone at the table knows but won't say: the peacock looks incredible and tastes like regret. But you'll applaud anyway. You'll praise the cook. You'll accept your small dry portion with gratitude. Because this meal isn't feeding your stomach. It's feeding something else entirely: status, identity, the story you'll tell tomorrow about the night you dined with a golden bird that breathed fire. The peacock is carried away. The next course approaches. Your stomach rumbles, still waiting for something that actually satisfies. Now forget the peacock's empty glamour for a moment. Let's talk about a creature that looks like something from a nightmare but tasted apparently like heaven, at least if you were a medieval English king. The lamprey. A jawless eel-like fish with concentric rows of teeth in a circular mouth, built for latching onto prey and sucking blood. It looks like what would happen if evolution had a bad day and decided to make a swimming toilet plunger with fangs. And yet kings died for this thing. Literally. Henry the Royal of England, son of William the Conqueror, ruler of a kingdom, ate too many lampreys in 1135 and never recovered. His physician had warned him. His doctors had begged him to stop. But Henry loved lampreys the way some people love chocolate, except more dangerously. He binged on them at a feast in Normandy against all medical advice, and within days he was dead. Food poisoning probably, or maybe his humours finally gave up trying to balance all that rich oily lamprey flesh. You'd think that would have ended the craze. It didn't. Lampreys remained a delicacy for centuries after. Kings demanded them. Nobles paid absurd prices. Coastal towns built entire economies around catching and shipping them inland, packed in salt, or kept alive in barrels of water. The city of Gloucester traditionally sent a lamprey pie to the reigning monarch every Christmas, a custom that continued into modern times, though with decreasing enthusiasm from the monarchs. So what made these nightmare fish so irresistible first rarity? Lampreys are anadromous, they live in the sea but swim upriver to spawn like salmon. You could only catch them during their migration runs and only in certain rivers. Scarcity equals status. If your neighbour couldn't get lampreys serving them at your table meant you had reach connections wealth. Second, the taste. Descriptions from medieval sources praise lamprey flesh as rich, fatty, almost buttery. The texture was apparently firm but yielded easily, not flaky like regular fish. It was substantial, filling, the kind of thing that stuck to your ribs in a satisfying, almost meaty way. Remember, this is a world where fat equals flavour equals survival. Lean fish were boring. Oily fish were treasures. Third, the preparation. Lampreys weren't just grilled and served. They were transformed. The most famous preparation was lamprey pie. The creatures were killed, cleaned cut into sections, then baked in a thick spiced pastry crust, with wine, their own blood, and a constellation of expensive seasonings. The blood was key. It thickened the sauce, gave it a dark, glossy intensity. Some recipes called for the lamprey to be partially cooked in its blood first, creating a reduction that was then incorporated into the pie. The resulting dish was dense, dark, pungent. Not for the faint of palate. You either loved it or you didn't, but you certainly remembered it. And if you served it, everyone knew you'd spent a small fortune not just on the lampreys themselves, but on the wine, the spices, the hours of skilled labour required to build that pie. But let's be honest about the other side of lamprey love, the danger. These fish, when not perfectly fresh, could be toxic. Their slime contains substances that can cause illness. Their rich fattiness, while delicious, was hell on medieval digestive systems, already strained by a diet heavy in meat and low in fibre. Physicians warned that lampreys were difficult to digest, generated thick humours, and burdened the stomach. They weren't wrong. Henry I was just the most famous victim. Plenty of lesser nobles probably suffered through lamprey-induced misery, but didn't make it into the chronicles. Historians still argue whether the lamprey obsession was purely about taste, or if symbolism played a role. Some scholars suggest that the lamprey's bizarre appearance, ancient alien, bottom-feeding yet prized, made it a perfect emblem of the upside-down nature of worldly value. Something ugly becoming beautiful through human desire, something lowly elevated to royal status. A reminder that worth is assigned, not inherent. Others think we're overthinking it. Maybe lampreys just tasted really, really good, and medieval nobles were willing to risk death for that fatty wine-dark richness, the same way modern foodies risk food poisoning for unpasteurized cheese or raw oysters. Either way, lamprey fever gripped England especially hard. While the continent certainly ate them, England's kings seemed uniquely obsessed. Perhaps it was the quality of English rivers for lamprey runs. Perhaps it was fashion, one king loved them, so the next had to love them more. Perhaps it was just the English predilection for turning the strangest possible thing into a beloved tradition, lamprey pie, meat jelly. Meat, eels in aspic. There's a pattern here. You're at that medieval table again, and a servant places a slice of lamprey pie before you. The crust is golden, the filling almost black glistening. You can smell wine and pepper and something else, iron blood the sea. Everyone watches to see if you'll eat it. You can't refuse. This is an honour. This might have cost more than your horse. You take a bite. The pastry shatters. The filling is dense, unctuous, coating your tongue with a flavour that's both familiar and utterly alien. Fish, yes, but richer than any fish you've known. The wine and spices cut through the fattiness but don't erase it. You swallow. Your stomach, unprepared for this onslaught of richness, shifts uncertainly. You smile anyway. You nod. You take another bite because to stop now would be an insult. Across the table the Lord beams. He served you something kings have died for. You're not sure if that's a boast or a warning. You keep chewing, you keep smiling. You make a mental note to avoid breakfast tomorrow. The lamprey pie sits there half-eaten, magnificent and monstrous. Somewhere in a cold river more lampreys swim upstream, unaware they're worth their weight in silver. Unaware that entire economies pivot on their backs. Unaware that Henry Thoreau would have lived longer if he'd just said no. Here's where medieval dining gets truly creative with its loopholes. You're a monk. It's Friday. Lent actually 40 days of fasting where meat is absolutely forbidden. Your soul depends on this abstinence. Your salvation hangs in the balance. You wake up hungry, you go to bed hungry, and in between you're expected to pray, work and contemplate the divine, while your stomach actively plots rebellion. But wait, there's porpoise for lunch. Yes, porpoise. That marine mammal, that warm-blooded, air-breathing creature that nurses its young and would by any reasonable biological definition qualify as meat. Except the medieval church didn't work on biological definitions, it worked on theological ones. And according to theological reasoning that would make a lawyer weep with joy, porpoise was fish. So was whale. So was beaver, specifically the tail, because it looked scaly, and the animal spent time in water. So were barnacle geese because they hatched from barnacles attached to driftwood. They didn't. But medieval bestiaries insisted they did, and who's going to argue with a book that has pictures? This wasn't cheating exactly, or rather it was cheating that everyone agreed to pretend wasn't cheating, which is basically how half of medieval religious life functioned. The logic went something like this: God forbade meat during fasting periods. Meat came from land animals. Creatures of the water were fish. Fish were permitted. Therefore porpoise, which lived in water, was fish. Theological checkmate. You can almost hear the monk who first proposed this standing before his abbot, making his case with a straight face while his stomach growled. But farther the porpoise dwells in the sea. Genesis separates the creatures of water from the creatures of land. Clearly this is a fish. And the abbot, equally hungry, equally tired of vegetable pottage, nodding slowly. You make an excellent point, brother. An excellent point indeed. Once the precedent was set, the floodgates opened. Whale meat became a coastal staple during Lent. Markets in port towns sold it like salted cod. The meat was dark, dense, oily, more like beef than any fish you'd recognize. It had to be soaked, boiled, spiced heavily to make it palatable, but it was permitted, and that's what mattered. Porpoise was considered finer fare. The meat was darker than whale, but more tender, almost liver-like in texture. Recipes survive describing how to prepare it. You'd parboil the meat first to remove some of the strong flavour, then roast it with a sauce made from wine, ginger and breadcrumbs. The result was something that tasted nothing like fish, but could be eaten with a clear conscience every Friday of the year. Beaver tail was another winner. The tail itself is flat, scaly looking and fatty, almost pure fat actually. French-Canadian trappers would later prize it as a delicacy. Medieval monks got there first. The theological reasoning was even flimsier here. Beavers spend time in water. The tail looks sort of fish-like, therefore it's fish. Never mind that the rest of the beaver furry four-legged, definitely mammalian remained forbidden. Just the tail. Just the part that could with squinting and generous interpretation pass for aquatic. Historians still argue whether church authorities genuinely believed these classifications or simply looked the other way, because everyone was miserable during Lent and morale mattered. Probably both. Medieval Christianity was excellent at maintaining rigid rules while simultaneously finding creative ways to bend them. It's not hypocrisy if you're sincere about your loopholes, and the monks, God bless them, were very sincere about their loopholes. Imagine being a coastal monastery in winter. Lent arrives. Proper fish, cod, herring, haddock are available but monotonous. You've eaten fish stew for 17 consecutive days. Your body craves something more substantial, something with heft. Then a fishing boat comes in with a whale calf. Small, manageable, technically fish. The cook gets to work. That night in the refectory you sit down to a meal that smells like roasted meat, looks like roasted meat, has the texture and richness of meat. But it's not meat, it's fish. Everyone knows this. Everyone agrees. You bow your head, give thanks and eat your fish with gratitude and zero irony. Your conscience is clear, your stomach is finally blessedly full. Did anyone outside the monastery mock this? Probably. Did satirists write poems about monks eating whale and calling it fish? Definitely some survive. But the practice continued because it met a genuine need. Fasting was serious business. Breaking fast days could mean penance, public shaming, even excommunication for repeat offenders. But fasting was also brutally hard, especially for people doing manual labour in cold climates. The loopholes weren't just theological gymnastics, they were survival mechanisms. And let's talk about the economics. Whale and porpoise weren't cheap, but they were more accessible than beef or pork during Lent when demand for meat alternatives spiked. Fishermen who landed a porpoise or whale calf during fasting season could command premium prices. Entire supply chains emerged around these creatures. Coastal monks became expert butchers of marine mammals, developing techniques to render the blubber preserve. The meat minimized the intense oiliness. Some monasteries traded in nothing but Lenten fish. They'd salt whale meat, barrel it, ship it inland to monasteries far from the coast. The recipients would soak it for days to remove the salt, then prepare it according to local recipes. It arrived tasting like salted whale, which is to say, pretty rough. But with enough wine, enough spices, enough garlic and onions and determination, it became edible. More than edible, it became a feast day centerpiece, a reminder that even in deprivation, God provided strange abundance. You're back at that table, Friday evening plate of dark meat in front of you swimming in peppery sauce. It's rich almost to the point of nausea, the texture somewhere between beef liver and tuna steak. You cut a piece chew slowly. Your mind says fish. Your mouth says liar. But the calendar says Friday, the church says permissible, and your hunger says shut up and eat. So you do. You eat your whale. You eat your porpoise. You save the beaver tail for special occasions. And every bite is both transgression and obedience, both compromise and devotion. Which really sums up medieval dining and maybe medieval life perfectly. Now let's step away from the monasteries and grand halls and walk into the forest edge where a peasant crouches by a small fire waiting. In the coals, wrapped in a thick coating of clay, something small and round bakes slowly. The clay hardens, cracks, steams. The smell that escapes is earthy, smoky, faintly sweet. This isn't a potato, those won't reach Europe for centuries. This is a hedgehog. Yes, a hedgehog. Those spiny little creatures that curl into defensive balls and snuffle through your garden at night eating slugs. Medieval peasants ate them. Not occasionally, not as a desperate famine food, but regularly enough that recipes and techniques were passed down through generations. And by most accounts they were genuinely tasty. The method was ingenious, born from necessity and observation. You can't exactly pluck a hedgehog like a chicken. Those spines are serious business, sharp enough to pierce skin, dense enough to make the creature nearly impossible to handle. Early hunters probably tried skinning them, and quickly learned that was a nightmare. Someone somewhere had a better idea, Clay. Here's how it worked. You'd catch your hedgehog, not difficult since they're slow, and their defense mechanism is to stop moving entirely. You'd kill it quickly, a blow to the head. Then, without removing anything, you'd coat the entire animal in thick wet clay an inch or more all around, sealing it completely. The clay became both cooking vessel and removal tool. You'd nestle this clay ball into the hot coals of your fire, not roaring flames, but the deep even heat of a well-established cooking fire. Then you'd wait. 30 minutes, sometimes longer, depending on the size of the hedgehog and the heat of your coals. The clay would harden, turning from grey to pale terracotta. Inside the hedgehog steamed in its own juices, the fat rendering the meat softening. When the clay cracked from the heat, you knew it was done. You'd pull it from the fire using sticks, let it cool just enough to handle, then crack the clay shell open like an egg. And here's the magic: the spines embedded in the clay pulled away with it. The skin often came too, leaving you with a small, tender, spine-free creature ready to eat. The meat itself was dark, rich, slightly gamey, think rabbit, but fattier or perhaps like dark chicken thigh with a more complex flavour. Hedgehogs, being insectivores, had a diet that gave their meat a distinctive taste. Not unpleasant, just different. Wild. Testimonies from the few modern foragers who've tried it legally in places where it's permitted describe it as surprisingly delicious, tender, moist, with a flavour somewhere between pork and game bird. Medieval peasants knew this. For them, hedgehogs represented free protein wandering through the underbrush. Unlike rabbits, which belonged to the lord and poaching them could cost you a hand, hedgehogs were common property. Nobody owned them. Nobody cared if you took them. They were slow, abundant, and required no special equipment to catch, just patience and quick hands. The clay baking method also meant you didn't need a pot, a spit, or any cookware at all. Just clay from the riverbank and a fire, both readily available. For people living in one-room cottages with minimal possessions, this efficiency mattered. You could cook a hedgehog in the same fire that warmed your home using materials that cost nothing. Historians still argue whether hedgehog was everyday food or occasional supplement. Records are scarce, peasants didn't write cookbooks. But the method appears in multiple sources across different regions and time periods, suggesting it was widespread knowledge. Folk traditions in parts of Europe mention hedgehog as poor man's pork, which implies familiarity, regularity, maybe even fondness. There's also the question of taboo. Some medieval authorities considered hedgehog unclean, associating it with witchcraft or devilry. The spines were thought to have malevolent properties, and the creature's nocturnal habits made it suspicious. But taboos are funny things. They exist most strongly where the temptation is greatest. If nobody wanted to eat hedgehog, there would be no need to forbid it. The reality was probably practical. If you were hungry and a hedgehog presented itself, you ate it. If you had other options, maybe you didn't. But unlike, say, rats, which were truly taboo and carried disease, hedgehogs were clean animals eating clean food. They posed no health risk. They were just small, spiny, and not conventionally farmed. Imagine you're that peasant by the fire. It's late autumn, winter's coming. The harvest is in, but it wasn't abundant. Every calorie counts. You spotted the hedgehog at dusk, snuffling near the woodpile. It took you 5 minutes to catch. Now it's baking and the smell makes your mouth water. You crack open the clay. Steam billows out, carrying that rich, earthy aroma. The hedgehog is curled slightly from the heat, golden brown, glistening with its own fat. You don't have a plate. You don't need one. You pull pieces off with your fingers, burning them slightly, not caring. The meat is tender, almost falling apart. The taste is strong, satisfying, real. You eat it all, meat, organs, everything except the bones. Nothing is wasted. Not when winter's knocking and your stores are marginal. The clay shell cooled now goes back into the earth. The bones go to the dog if you have one, or into the midden. By morning there's no evidence this meal ever happened except the fullness in your belly and the slight grease still on your fingers. The hedgehog fed you without ceremony, without fanfare. It was never going to appear at a noble's table or get mentioned in a chronicle. But it sustained people nonetheless, countless people across centuries who never wrote down their recipes but passed them along anyway. Parent to child, neighbour to neighbour, the knowledge surviving because it was useful. And somewhere in the forest, another hedgehog waddles through the fallen leaves, oblivious to its place in culinary history, looking for beetles and worms, living its small, spiny life. You watch it pass. Your stomach is full tonight. Maybe tomorrow night too, if you're lucky. Maybe not. The hedgehog disappears into the underbrush. You tend your fire. The night grows cold. Now let's travel backward briefly across the Alps to where Rome's influence still lingers in medieval European kitchens like a ghost nobody invited but everyone tolerates. The Romans had a thing for dormice. Not metaphorically, literally. They bred them, fattened them in special clay jars called gliraria, fed them nuts and acorns until the tiny rodents were plump and drowsy, then cooked and ate them as delicacies. When Rome fell, the empire crumbled, the aqueducts broke, the roads went to ruin. But the taste for dormice that survived. Medieval Europe, especially in regions that had been Roman provinces, inherited this peculiar craving. Dormice weren't everyday peasant food like hedgehogs. They were fancier, requiring more preparation, carrying echoes of classical sophistication. If you served dormice, you were signalling continuity with the ancient world, or at least pretending to. First, understand what dormice are. Not house mice, not rats. Dormice are small, chubby rodents with bushy tails, big, dark eyes, and a tendency to hibernate for months. They're arboreal, living in trees, eating hazelnuts and chestnuts and whatever else they can gnaw. They're also crucially far cuter than rats, which probably helped their culinary reputation. It's easier to eat something adorable than something that lives in your grain sack and carries plague. The Romans perfected the dormouse fattening system. You'd catch wild dormice in late summer, when they were already plump preparing for hibernation. Then you'd house them in terracotta jars with air holes kept in dark places to simulate winter burrows. Inside, you'd give them unlimited nuts. The dormice, thinking winter had arrived, would eat obsessively, storing fat for the long sleep. Except the sleep never came because you kept feeding them, kept them drowsy, but not fully hibernating, kept them eating until they were almost spherical. When you wanted to cook them, you'd remove them from the jar's sluggish fat, barely able to move, and dispatch them quickly. Recipes varied. Some called for roasting them whole on tiny spits. Others stuffed them with pork mince and pine nuts. Yes, stuffing a mouse with meat Romans were nothing if not extra. The most elaborate preparations glazed them with honey and poppy seeds, creating a sweet, savoury crust. Medieval cooks simplified this. They didn't have the elaborate gliraria system who had time to engineer specialised rodent fattening jars, but they knew the principle. Catch dormice during their natural fattening season. Keep them briefly in cages, feeding them hazelnuts. Then cook them simply, often roasted, sometimes in pies with other small game birds. The meat was rich, nutty flavoured from their diet, fattier than you'd expect from such a small creature. Medieval sources that mention them describe dormouse as delicate, almost sweet, a tiny indulgence. You'd eat several in one sitting, they're mouse-sized after all. Pop them in your mouth whole or pick the meat off with your fingers, sucking the tiny bones clean. But here's where it gets interesting. Dormice existed in a weird culinary and social space. They were too small and fiddly to be practical protein for anyone seriously hungry. They required specialized knowledge to catch and prepare. They referenced a pagan imperial past that the Christian medieval world officially rejected, and yet they persisted, especially in regions like France, Italy, and parts of Germany, where Roman influence had been strongest. Historians still argue whether medieval dormouse eating was genuine taste preference or performative classicism. Were nobles really enjoying the flavour, or were they eating them because ancient texts said Romans ate them, and eating like Romans made you seem educated, cultured, connected to that lost golden age? Probably both, honestly. Humans are excellent at convincing themselves that something tastes good when it's supposed to be prestigious. There's also the theological wrinkle where dormice meat. They were warm-blooded, furry, land-dwelling, definitely meat by any reasonable standard. But they were rodents occupying a grey zone in the medieval mind between proper animals and vermin. Some sources suggest dormice might have been eaten during fast days classified somehow as not quite meat. This seems dubious, but we've already established that medieval fast day classifications could be creative when hunger called. By the late medieval period, dormouse eating was fading. The elaborate Roman systems were forgotten. Catching wild dormice was tedious. Other small game, quail, woodcock, thrush provided similar delicacy with less folkloric baggage. But in certain circles among certain cooks who fancied themselves cultured, dormice remained on the menu as curiosities. Picture yourself at a provincial noble's table somewhere in southern France, early 14th century. The lord has hired a cook who claims to know classical receipts. Tonight's feast includes dormice served on a silver platter, glazed with honey surrounded by autumn nuts, a still life arranged to imply abundance, knowledge, taste. You're handed 3. They're tiny, golden, sticky with honey. Everyone watches to see your reaction. This is a test. Do you recognize the reference? Do you appreciate the effort you pick one up? It's heavier than expected, dense with fat. You bite. The skin cracks. The meat inside is tender, rich, faintly sweet from the honey and the creature's nut-heavy diet. The texture is fine-grained, almost moussey, which makes sense given what it is. The bones are delicate enough to crunch through if you choose or spit out if you're polite. You chew, you swallow, you nod approvingly. It tastes like trying too hard, like reaching for a glory that's been dead for 800 years, but it also tastes good, genuinely good in a weird, tiny, overpriced way. You eat the second dormouse, the third. You wonder how many hazelnuts died for this moment. You wonder if Romans actually enjoyed these or if they were trying too hard too. The platter is cleared. The next course arrives, something more straightforward, thank God, maybe venison. The dormice are forgotten within minutes, which is probably their fate in history too. A footnote, a curiosity, a weird little inheritance from a dead empire kept alive by people who couldn't quite let go. Somewhere in the forest, dormice prepare for real, winter sleep fat on real hazelnuts, dreaming whatever dormice dream. None of them in clay jars, none of them destined for silver platters. Just small sleepy creatures doing what their bodies tell them, unaware they were once served with honey to impress dinner guests. Now we arrive at one of the most famous, most misunderstood, most genuinely bizarre dishes in medieval culinary history, the blackbird pie. You know the nursery rhyme, 24 blackbirds baked in a pie. You probably thought it was nonsense, a bit of whimsical poetry with no basis in reality. You were wrong. They actually did this. They baked birds into pies, sometimes dozens of them, and then released them mid-feast to create chaos, wonder, and presumably a significant amount of bird droppings on the dinner guests. This wasn't food. This was entertainment. This was the medieval equivalent of a flash mob, a surprise party, and performance art rolled into one edible package, and it required serious engineering. Here's how it worked. The cook would build 2 separate pie crusts, an outer shell meant to survive the oven, and an inner structure that wouldn't actually be baked. The outer crust was thick, sturdy, heavily reinforced, basically a pastry fortress. It went into the oven alone, baked until solid, then cooled. This created the container. Meanwhile, the birds, blackbirds, usually sometimes other small songbirds, were kept alive and relatively calm, probably in darkened cages to keep them docile. When the moment came to assemble the presentation pie, the cook would place the birds inside the pre-baked shell, possibly with a little food and definitely with air holes concealed in the decoration. Then the lid was placed on top, sealed just enough to stay put but not so tight the birds would suffocate. The pie processed into the hall, looking like any other massive feast pie. It sat on the table, magnificent cryptic. Then came the reveal. Sometimes the Lord himself would cut into it. Sometimes a designated carver would do the honours. The knife broke through the crust, the lid lifted, and suddenly 24 confused, terrified birds exploded into the air. Imagine the scene. The great hall, already noisy with conversation and music, erupts into pandemonium. Birds everywhere flying into rafters, landing in people's hair, knocking over goblets, defecating on expensive tapestries. Dogs bark and leap. Servants shriek. Children laugh. The birds, desperate to escape, circle the room in frantic loops, bashing into walls, seeking windows that often don't exist or are too high to reach. It's chaos. Absolute, glorious chaos. And that was exactly the point. This was spectacle entertainment in an age before theatre, before cinema, before television. The medieval feast was the show. Every course needed to impress, but some courses needed to astonish. The bird pie delivered. It violated expectations. It turned dinner into something alive, unpredictable, memorable. Guests would talk about it for years. But and this is important, you didn't eat the bird pie. Not the birds, anyway. Sometimes the empty crust was filled afterward with actual food, a meat pie or custard for eating. But the birds themselves, if they survived the ordeal and could be caught, they were usually released or kept as pets. This wasn't about protein. This was about power, about showing you could command animals' kitchens and the very nature of surprise itself. Historians still argue whether bird pies were common or exceptionally rare. The written records mention them, but not frequently. They appear in accounts of royal weddings, coronations, major diplomatic feasts, occasions where someone needed to make a statement. For ordinary nobles, the effort and risk probably outweighed the reward. Birds could die from stress before the reveal, ruining the effect. The pie could crack prematurely. The birds could be too sluggish or too frenzied. A dozen things could go wrong, and in a world where your reputation rode on every feast that was dangerous. Some versions of the bird pie included other surprises. Accounts mention pies containing not just birds but also frogs, rabbits, or even a dwarf or child who would pop out and recite poetry. The line between feast and circus was porous. If you could fit it in pastry and surprise people with it, someone probably tried. There's also a darker reading. The bird pie demonstrated dominion over nature in a very literal way, taking creatures of the air, symbols of freedom, and trapping them in baked earth, then releasing them only to be trapped again by wolves and hunting dogs. It's hard not to see the power dynamics at play. The Lord controls even the bird's flight. Nothing escapes his table without his permission. But maybe that's overthinking it. Maybe it was just fun. Maybe medieval nobles living in a world of rigid hierarchy and endless protocol wanted one moment where something wild and unpredictable happened. Maybe the bird pie was their version of a roller coaster, a controlled danger, a sanctioned surprise. You're sitting at that table when the pie arrives. You've heard rumours. You know something is supposed to happen. The carver approaches. The knife descends. The crust breaks. And suddenly the air is full of wings and panic and feathers drifting down like snow. A blackbird lands on your shoulder, heart hammering against its tiny ribs. It stays there for 3 seconds, long enough for you to feel its terror, its warmth, its frantic aliveness, then launches away toward the rafters. You watch it go, watch all of them spiral and swoop, and for just a moment the hierarchy dissolves. Everyone is equal in surprise. The Duke and the Squire both duck when a bird dive bombs past. Then the moment passes. Servants move to catch the birds. Order reasserts itself. The next course arrives, something edible this time, thank God. But the memory remains. The impossible made real. Dinner that flew. If the bird pie was theatrical, the cockatrice was downright surreal. A creature that never existed in nature, but appeared regularly on medieval tables, as if God had simply forgotten to create it during Genesis. Take the front half of a piglet. Take the back half of a capon, sew them together, roast the result, serve it with a straight face. This is the cockatrice, and it's exactly as weird as it sounds. The name itself is a mash-up cock for rooster entris, possibly from heifer, though the etymology gets murky and honestly doesn't matter because the thing is a sewn-together pig-chicken monster, and the name is the least strange part. Some regions called it a cottagris, linking it to the cockatrice, that mythical serpent-rooster hybrid. The symbolism was intentional. This wasn't just food. This was a statement about man's ability to reshape creation itself. Here's the construction method. You'd slaughter a young pig and a large capon, ideally similar in size, though perfect matching was rare. Then came the butchery. You'd cut each animal in half roughly at the midsection. The division needed to be clean, but didn't need to be anatomically precise. This wasn't surgery. It was kitchen carpentry. Next, the sewing. Using kitchen twine or even wire, the cook would attach the pig's front half to the capon's rear or vice versa. Some cockentristes were pig front, chicken back. Others reversed it. Regional variations existed, and presumably fierce kitchen debates about which combination was correct, as if correctness applies to imaginary hybrid livestock. The sewing had to be tight. During roasting, fats would render flesh would shrink, and poorly secured seams would split, destroying the illusion. Good cooks used tight, frequent stitches, sometimes reinforced with wooden pins pushed through both halves. The goal was structural integrity that would survive an hour or more on a spit. Once assembled, the cockatrice was treated like any other roast. You'd put it on a spit, position it over a good fire, and roast it slowly, basting constantly. The pig half and chicken half cooked at different rates. Pork needs more time. Chicken dries out faster, so timing was crucial. Undercook the pork and you'd poison someone. Overcook the chicken, and it became leather. The cook had to monitor both halves independently, sometimes shielding one side while exposing the other to direct heat. When finished, the cockatrice was presented whole, often gilded with egg yolk or adorned with its own feathers stuck back into the chicken half. It processed into the hall on a platter, this impossible creature, and guests reacted with delighted confusion. What are we looking at is that? It can't be, but it is. The carving was part of the show. You couldn't just hack into a cockatrice like a normal roast. The carver had to acknowledge both halves, slicing pork for some guests' chicken, for others making a theatrical display of the creature's dual nature. My lord, will you take from the swine or the fowl, as if it were a menu choice and not a single abomination. Taste-wise it was exactly what you'd expect. Pork and chicken. Separately they're both fine. Together on one plate, nothing special. The pork half tasted like pork. The chicken half tasted like chicken. There was no magical flavour fusion, no culinary transcendence. It was two meats competently roasted, served in the most complicated way possible. So why bother? Same reason as the bird pie, the gilded peacock, the ice sculpture swans that would appear at later medieval feasts because you could. because it demonstrated mastery over the kitchen, over animals, over reality itself. The cockatrice announced that the host commanded resources and skill sufficient to make the impossible routine. There's also the symbolism angle. Medieval minds loved allegory, saw meaning in everything. A creature half of earth pig and half of air fowl could represent the union of earthly and spiritual, body and soul, noble and common. Or it could represent nothing except, look at this weird thing we made. Historians still argue the diners probably didn't care. They were too busy being impressed. Cockatrices appeared at weddings, occasionally two creatures becoming one, get it? They showed up at diplomatic feasts where novelty mattered. They featured in culinary competitions between nobles' kitchens, each trying to outcook the other. But they were never common. The effort-to-reward ratio was terrible unless you desperately needed to impress someone. Some sources mention other hybrid roasts: pig front gooseback, lamb front duckback. The possibilities were theoretically endless, limited only by the cook's ambition and the diner's tolerance for weirdness. Most stuck with pig and chicken, though. It was the classic, the standard, the one people had heard of. You're at that table again. The cockatrice arrives. You stare at it, this stitched-together impossibility. Its pig snout pointed one direction, its chicken drumsticks pointed another. It shouldn't exist. It doesn't exist, not really. It's meat and string and human audacity given form. The carver offers you the pork half. You accept. It's good pork, well cooked, properly seasoned, no different from any feast pig. Except it has chicken legs. Except it represents hours of unnecessary labour. Except it exists solely because someone decided the normal way of serving dinner wasn't strange enough. You chew your portion. Across the table, someone gets the chicken half. You wonder if they feel differently about their meal, or if everyone is thinking the same thing: this is delicious and stupid in equal measure. The cockatrice is carved away to nothing. The illusion dissolves into separate, sensible pieces of meat. By the end, it's just dinner again. But for those first few minutes, it was something else. Something that made you question what was possible. Something that made dinner a little bit magical, a little bit wrong, and entirely unforgettable. The bones are cleared away. No one suggests reassembling them. Some things only work once. Let's step away from the sewn-together nightmares and talk about something that actually tasted good, commanded genuine respect and carried weight, both literal and symbolic: the boar's head. Christmas wasn't Christmas in medieval England without a massive boar's head, processed into the hall, tusks gleaming apple, clenched in its jaws, carried on a platter by strong men while everyone sang. This was tradition. This was ceremony. This was the one dish that united symbolism, flavour and spectacle into something that actually worked. The boar itself was dangerous game. Wild boars weren't the pink domestic pigs snoozing in sties. They were massive, aggressive, razor-tusked creatures that could disembowel a hunting dog or gore a man's leg to the bone. Hunting them was genuinely risky sport reserved for skilled huntsmen with good dogs and better nerves. When you brought down a boar, you'd earned it. But the real work started after the kill. You couldn't just hack the head off and roast it. The preparation was elaborate, part cooking and part ritual. First, the head was removed carefully, keeping the skull intact, preserving the shape. The brain was removed, sometimes eaten separately, sometimes discarded. The head was then scrubbed, singed to remove hair, and prepared for long, slow cooking. Some recipes called for boiling the head first hours in salted water with herbs, bay, sage, rosemary. This made the meat tender, rendered some of the fat, and allowed the bone structure to stay intact while the flesh cooked through. Other recipes went straight to roasting, but that risked uneven cooking, charred snout raw skull base. Boiling first was safer. After boiling, the head was glazed sometimes with honey, sometimes with a mixture of egg yolk and saffron to give it a golden sheen. The tusks were polished. The eyes, which had been removed during cleaning, were sometimes replaced with glazed chestnuts or plums for the presentation. An apple or orange was jammed into the mouth, partly for decoration, partly to keep the jaws open in that fierce, frozen snarl. Then came the procession. This wasn't servants sneaking food out from the kitchen. This was theatre. Torchbearers led. Musicians followed, playing specifically composed boar's head carols, yes, entire songs written just for this moment. Then the head itself borne on a massive platter, sometimes decorated with holly and bay branches, trailing steam, and the smell of roasted pork and spices. The hall would rise. Everyone stood. The song swelled. The boar's head in hand, bare I bedecked with bays and rosemary. It was solemn and joyful simultaneously, acknowledgment that Christmas had truly arrived, that the darkest part of winter had been marked with this ancient ritual. The symbolism ran deep. The boar represented winter itself, fierce, dangerous, needing to be conquered. Its death meant spring would come. The ceremony reenacted that victory. Some scholars connect it to pre-Christian solstice rituals, suggesting the boar was once a sacred animal whose sacrifice ensured the sun's return. Christianity layered its own meanings over this, the boar as sin, as the devil as wildness tamed by faith. But honestly, it was also just delicious. Boar meat is richer than pork gamia with more complex flavour. The head especially, with all its varied textures, cheek meat, tender and fatty tongue, rich and smooth ears, crispy bits of crackling from the skin, offered something for every taste. After the ceremony, the head was carved and distributed, choice pieces going to honoured guests, the rest shared throughout the hall. And unlike the peacock or cock-and-treats, people actually wanted to eat this. The meat didn't just look impressive, it satisfied. Boar cheek, slow cooked until it fell apart, was genuinely prized. The tongue, when properly prepared, was a delicacy. Even the ears, roasted crisp, had their devotees. Historians still argue whether the boar's head ceremony was universal or primarily English. Records from England document it extensively, especially at Oxford and Cambridge colleges, where the tradition persisted for centuries. Continental Europe had boar feasts too, but the elaborate head processions seems especially English. That peculiar combination of paganism, Christianity, and theatrical excess that characterises so much of English medieval culture. The ceremony also marked social cohesion. Everyone participated, lord and servant, old and young. Everyone sang the carol. Everyone received a portion, even if the lord got cheek meat and the scullery boy got ear gristle. For one night the boar's head created a kind of temporary equality, a shared acknowledgement that winter was hard for everyone, and its conquest deserved celebration. You're in that hall on Christmas night. The fire roars. The evergreen branches smell sharp and clean. Then the music starts distant, at first growing closer. The doors open. Torchlight floods in, and there it is. The boar's head, tusks like dagger's apple, like a stopped scream skin glazed gold, steaming in the cold air. You stand with everyone else. You sing even if you don't know all the words. You feel something primal stir, not quite fear, not quite awe, something older than either. The head passes close enough to smell pork fat, wood smoke, honey herbs, winter itself rendered edible. Later you get your portion, a slice of cheek meat, tender and rich, still warm. It tastes like survival, like victory over cold and dark and hunger, like a promise that spring will come because it always has, because the boar has been conquered again. The bones are saved. The skull, once picked clean, might decorate the hall for the rest of winter, a trophy, a totem, a reminder. The tusks especially were prized, sometimes mounted, sometimes carved into knife handles. Nothing was wasted. The creature that represented winter's danger became winter's sustenance, then winter's ornament. Full circle. Perfect symmetry. Outside snow falls. Inside bellies are full and the fire never dies. The boar's head brought you here. Tomorrow will be cold again, but tonight you feast. Now we need to talk about something that sounds boring until you realize it replaced nearly everything liquid in medieval cooking and made the impossible possible: almond milk. Not the modern carton from the health food aisle. Medieval almond milk was different, thicker, richer, more central to the entire culinary universe. It was the workhorse of the medieval kitchen, the solution to 100 problems. The reason fish days didn't mean starvation, and Lent didn't mean giving up flavour entirely. Here's the problem it solved: dairy was forbidden during fasting periods, which covered about a third of the year, when you added up all the Friday's Lent Advent and various saints' vigils. No butter, no cream, no milk, no cheese. For a cuisine built on these ingredients, this created a crisis. How do you make sauces? How do you enrich soups? How do you add body to anything? Almond milk was the answer. And it was everywhere, in fish dishes, in vegetable pottages, in sweet custards, in savoury pies, in morning porridge, in evening soups. It appears in nearly every medieval cookbook, sometimes multiple times per page. So ubiquitous, the scribes abbreviated it to Olmia milk to save ink. Making it was labour-intensive but straightforward. You'd start with blanched almonds skinned, which meant soaking them in hot water until the skin slipped off, then peeling each one individually. Hundreds of almonds, thousands for a large household. Someone's entire morning was spent peeling almonds. Fingers wrinkled from the water, the pile growing slowly. Once blanched, the almonds were ground. Not chopped, ground to a fine paste using a mortar and pestle, or later a grinding stone. This took serious arm strength and time. You'd grind until the almonds became a smooth, oily paste, almost butter-like. Then came the crucial step: you'd add water little by little, working it into the almond paste, breaking it down, coaxing out the fats and proteins. The mixture was then strained through cloth linen, usually fine weave, held over a bowl. You'd gather the cloth, twist it, squeeze hard, wringing out every drop of precious liquid. What remained in the cloth was almond meal, dry, relatively tasteless, sometimes used in baking, but considered the inferior byproduct. What dripped into the bowl was almond milk, white, creamy, rich, slightly sweet from the almonds themselves. The ratio determined thickness. More water made thin almond milk used like regular milk in everyday cooking. Less water made thick almond milk almost cream-like, used to enrich sauces or make puddings. The thickest version, barely liquid, was called almond cream and functioned exactly like dairy cream in recipes. And it worked. Not perfectly almond milk doesn't behave identically to dairy milk. It doesn't curdle into cheese. It separates if overheated. But it adds richness, body, a subtle, nutty sweetness that enhanced rather than dominated. In fish dishes especially, almond milk was transformative, softening harsh flavours, creating silky sauces, making Lenten meals feel less like penance. The cost, though: almonds were expensive, imported from Mediterranean regions where they grew abundantly. Northern European cooks used them anyway because there was no alternative. Some households went through pounds of almonds weekly during fasting seasons. The wealthy bought them by the sack. The less wealthy economized, making thinner milk using less per recipe, stretching it as far as possible. Historians still argue whether almond milk tasted good or was merely tolerated. Sources are contradictory. Some medieval writers praise it as delicate and fine. Others treat it as simply necessary with no commentary on flavour. Probably both views coexisted like any ingredient. Some people loved it. Some found it adequate. Some missed real dairy desperately but ate what the church allowed. There were also alternatives, though none as successful. Walnut milk appeared, occasionally made the same way but with walnuts. It had a stronger, more bitter flavour and never caught on widely. Hazelnut milk shows up in a few recipes. Some desperate cooks tried pine nut milk, which was absurdly expensive and barely different from almond. In the end, almonds dominated because they worked best, abundant enough to be accessible, mild enough to be versatile, rich enough to satisfy. The cultural impact was enormous. Almond milk didn't just enable fasting, it shaped medieval flavour profiles entirely. That characteristic sweetness underlying savoury medieval dishes, often almond milk. The smooth, rich texture of medieval fish stews, almond milk. The ability to create cream sauces without dairy, all almond milk. It also democratised flavour somewhat. A peasant couldn't afford saffron or imported spices, but almonds, while not cheap, were within reach during Lent when everyone needed them and supply increased. A modest household could make almond milk for their fish soup, participate in the same basic cuisine as their betters, experience that richness, even if their version was thinner, their portions smaller. You're in a medieval kitchen during Lent. Your arms ache from grinding almonds. Your fingers are raw from peeling. You've made 3 batches already today, thin milk for the morning pottage, medium for the fish dinner, thick for the Lord's special pikin cream sauce that's not actually cream because it's Friday. You squeeze the cloth one more time. The last drops fall into the bowl. The liquid is white as snow, smooth as silk. You dip a finger, taste. It's nutty, faintly sweet, rich, despite containing no dairy at all. It's not milk, not really, but it's close enough. It'll do what milk does, bind, enrich, comfort. Tonight someone will eat that fish and cream sauce and never think about the hours you spent grinding almonds. They'll taste richness and be satisfied. They'll stay within the rules and feel no deprivation, and that's the point. That's what almond milk gave the medieval world permission to fast without suffering, to follow church law without abandoning flavour. The bowl sits full. Tomorrow you'll grind more almonds, next week more. All through Lent your days will smell like almonds, your hands will ache, and the white liquid will flow and flow. If almond milk was practical magic, subtleties were pure fantasy made edible, or semi-edible, or occasionally not edible at all, but you weren't really supposed to eat them anyway. These were sugar sculptures, marzipan monuments, elaborate confections shaped into castles, saints' ships, heraldic beasts, entire scenes from mythology or scripture. They sat on medieval tables, blurring the line between food and art so completely that guests often didn't know whether to admire them or devour them. The name itself, subtlety or subtlety, referred to their subtle, clever nature, not subtle as in understated. Medieval people had no concept of understated. Subtle as in ingenious, cunningly made, requiring intelligence and skill to create. These were centerpieces that demonstrated the cook's artistry and the host's wealth in the most conspicuous way imaginable. The base material was usually marzipan, the almond paste sweetened with sugar or honey, kneaded until smooth and pliable like clay. Remember all those almonds from earlier, they had another use. Ground almonds mixed with sugar created a substance that could be moulded, sculpted, painted, assembled into virtually any shape. It dried hard enough to hold detail, tasted pleasant enough to eat, and looked impressive enough to justify the expense. Sugar paste was the other primary medium. Pure white sugar, expensive as gold in early medieval times, was mixed with gum arabic or egg white to create a paste that could be rolled thin-shaped, hardened. Later medieval cooks developed sugar boiling techniques, creating everything from spun sugar threads to clear sugar windows for their edible castles. The subjects varied by occasion. At a royal wedding you might see marzipan figures of the bride and groom surrounded by sugar angels. At a religious feast, saints in full colour, their halos gilded with actual gold leaf. At a diplomatic dinner, the coats of arms of both kingdoms rendered in coloured sugar paste flanked by heraldic lions or eagles. Some subtleties were narrative. An entire biblical scene, the Annunciation, the Nativity, the Last Supper, recreated in sugar and marzipan, each figure carefully painted, each detail attended to. These weren't quick decorations. They took days, sometimes weeks to complete. Specialist confectioners were employed solely for this work, their skills valued as highly as any artist's. The most ambitious subtleties were architectural, full castles with towers, battlements, working drawbridges, ships with sails and rigging, forests with individual trees. These often incorporated other materials, wafers for walls, gold leaf for accents, coloured sugar panes for windows, spun sugar for flowing water. They could be enormous, requiring multiple men to carry them into the hall. And here's the strange part, many were meant to be eaten eventually, but not immediately. They'd be displayed throughout the feast, admired, discussed their symbolism, decoded by educated guests. Only at the very end would they be broken apart and distributed. By then they'd been sitting out for hours, handled by servants, breathed on by dozens of diners. The sugar was safe enough, but nobody pretended this was hygienic. You ate your piece of the subtlety because it was an honour, not because you were hungry. Some subtleties, though, were purely decorative from the start. Too elaborate to dismantle, too fragile to distribute, they were removed intact after the feast and preserved as curiosities. Wealthy households kept sugar sculptures for years, displaying them like we might display fine china. They'd grow dusty, probably attract mice, definitely weren't edible anymore, but they remained as trophies of past magnificence. The symbolism was everything. A subtlety wasn't just pretty, it communicated messages. At a feast honouring a military victory, you might see a sugar fortress being stormed by marzipan soldiers. At a coming-of-age celebration, a young knight in sugar receiving his spurs. At a funeral feast, yes, those existed, perhaps a soul, ascending to heaven, angels guiding it upward, all in white sugar paste. Historians still argue how widespread subtleties were. They dominate the surviving feast records of royalty and high nobility, appearing at virtually every major banquet. But did lesser nobles have them? Probably simpler versions, a single marzipan figure rather than an entire scene. Did wealthy merchants copy the fashion? Almost certainly, though, on a smaller scale. As sugar became gradually more accessible through the late medieval period, subtleties trickled down the social ladder, shrinking but persisting. The skill required was genuine. You needed sculptors' hands, painters' eyes, engineers' mind. You had to understand how sugar behaved at different temperatures, how marzipan dried, how to create armatures from wire or wood to support larger pieces. You needed to mix pigments, ground flowers for reds, saffron for yellows, indigo for blues, and apply them without smearing. This was craft at the highest level. You're at that feast table. The meal is nearly finished, too many courses, too much wine, too much everything. Then the doors open one final time. Servants enter carrying something that takes your breath. A castle perfect in miniature, every stone rendered in sugar, every window a pane of clear sugar boiled to transparency. Tiny marzipan knights stand guard. A sugar banner flies from the highest tower. It processes past you slowly. You see the detail up close, the mortar lines between sugar stones, the individual links in the knight's chain mail, the painted faces on figures the size of your thumb. Hours and hours of labour passed by in seconds. It reaches the high table, is displayed, admired. The Lord stand says something about the symbolism, the skill, the honour. You clap with everyone else. You wonder if you'll get a piece. You wonder if you even want one by the time it's distributed, that sugar will be stale, that marzipan softened by room humidity. But you'll take it anyway if offered. You'll carry that fragment home, show your family. This was a tower. You'll let your children taste it, one small bite each. It'll be the sweetest thing they've tasted all year. They'll remember it forever, not the flavour really, but the idea. That food could be art. That sugar could be stone. That dinner could be magic. Now let's talk about a phrase that's survived to the present day, usually misunderstood, and originates from a meal that tells you everything about medieval social hierarchy in one dish, humble pie, or as it eventually became, humble pie. When someone says you're eating humble pie, they mean you're being forced to accept humiliation. But originally humble pie was just food, specific food, the food of servants, the food made from the parts nobody else wanted. Humbles were the offal of deer, the heart, liver, kidneys, lungs, intestines, basically any internal organ the huntsman could salvage after the kill. When a deer was brought down, there was a strict protocol for butchering. The best cuts, haunches, saddle loin, went to the lord and his high table. Secondary cuts went to honoured guests and family. Everything else was distributed down the hierarchy. The humbles went to the hunt servants, the beaters, the dog handlers, the lower household staff. Not as punishment, these organs were perfectly edible, nutritious even. But they required different preparation, different cooking methods, and they definitely didn't have the prestige of venison steaks. You could identify someone's social status by which part of the deer they ate. The pie itself was practical cooking. You couldn't roast humbles like prime cuts, they dry out, toughen, become inedible. But chopped up, stewed slowly, mixed with onions and herbs and cheap wine, then baked inside a thick pastry crust, they transformed into something genuinely edible. The long cooking broke down tough tissue. The pastry absorbed the rich, slightly metallic flavour of organ meat. The result was hearty, filling, and definitely not refined. The crust was important. Like many medieval pies, the pastry wasn't necessarily meant to be eaten. It was a cooking vessel, thick, sturdy, made from coarse flour, and water sometimes barely salted. You'd line a dish with this coffin pastry, fill it with the humble mixture, top it with another layer of crust, seal it, and bake it for hours. The pastry kept everything moist, trapped the flavours, and could be broken away at serving time. But often servants ate the crust too. Waste nothing. If the pastry was edible, and with enough gravy soaked in it, usually was you ate it. Bread was bread even when it doubled as cookware. The phrase, eating humble pie, emerged gradually. First, it was just humble pie, the thing servants ate. Then linguistic drift happened. Humble sounded like humble, especially in certain dialects. And since eating, humble pie marked you as lower status, the pun practically made itself. Eating humble pie meant accepting your place, acknowledging you weren't getting venison, taking what you were given without complaint. By the time the phrase entered common usage, the actual pies were fading from regular consumption. Deer hunting became more restricted, reserved for aristocracy. Servants ate different foods, but the metaphor stuck because it captured something essential about medieval dining. You literally ate your social position. Historians still argue whether humble pie tasted good. Some sources suggest it was quite palatable, especially when fresh and well spiced. Organ meats properly prepared can be delicious, rich, complex, deeply flavoured. A good cook could make humble pie something people actually looked forward to, not just tolerated. But other sources treat it dismissively as poor man's food, the thing you ate when you couldn't have real venison. The truth, as usual, probably lived somewhere between. Fresh deer organs, cooked by a skilled servant with access to decent ingredients, probably produced a fine pie. Old organs hastily cooked with minimal seasoning probably produced something you choke down because you were hungry. The division of the deer also tells us about medieval values. Nothing was wasted, everything had its place and its recipient, but that distribution reinforced hierarchy at every level. The lord got the glory cuts. His family got slightly less glory. Knights and honoured guests got respectable portions. Servants got organs. Dogs got bones. Even the deer's death served the social order. There were other umble dishes too. Umble porridge organs chopped fine simmered until they broke down into a thick stew. Umble sausages, organs, and scraps stuffed into intestines. Every culture with hunting traditions developed organ dishes, but the English umble pie became particularly associated with servitude, perhaps because England's class divisions were especially rigid, especially performed through food. You're a hunt servant standing in the kitchen after a successful deer hunt. The lord and his guests are in the hall dining on roasted haunch, praising the tenderness, the flavour. You're here with the other servants and the cook has just pulled the umble pie from the oven. The crust is dark brown, cracked slightly, steam escaping. The smell is strong liver kidney herbs wine pastry. It's not unpleasant exactly, just different from the refined roast aromas wafting from the hall. The cook breaks the crust ladle's thick stew onto your wooden bowl. You tear off a piece of crust dip it eat. It's rich, almost overwhelming. The organ flavour is present, metallic, deep, strong. But the spices help. The wine helps. The hunger helps most. You've been working since dawn, beating through brush-handling dogs carrying the kill back. This pie is substantial filling warming. It's not venison haunch, but it's not nothing. Around you other servants eat. Nobody complains. Nobody compares their meal to what the Lord is eating. That would be pointless. This is your portion. This is what the hierarchy provides. You eat your umble pie and you're grateful for it because the alternative is no pie at all. Tomorrow there might be no deer. Tomorrow might be pottage and old bread. Today there's meat, organ meat, yes, but meat nonetheless. You finish your portion. Your stomach is full. The phrase hasn't been invented yet, but you're literally eating humble pie. And for tonight at least it's enough. Now let's discuss something that sounds absurd until you see the medieval records and realise entire regional economies swam on the backs of these creatures' eels. Not as occasional food, not as curiosity, but as currency, as rent, as taxes paid by the thousand to landlords who measured wealth, not in coins, but in slithery snake-like fish delivered annually by terrified tenants. The Domesday Book, William the Conqueror's massive survey of England completed in 1086, records eel rents everywhere. One estate owed 60,000 eels per year, another 4,000. Small holdings might owe only a few hundred, but they still owed them. Eels weren't supplemental payment. They were the payment as official and required as money. Why eels? Because they were abundant, valuable, and crucially transportable. Eels could survive out of water for hours if kept damp. You could pack them in barrels with wet moss, stack those barrels in wagons, and transport them across the country. They'd arrive alive or alive enough. This made them practical currency in ways most fish weren't. They were also everywhere. European eels have a strange life cycle. They spawn in the Sargasso Sea, then larvae drift across the Atlantic, arriving at European coasts as tiny glass eels. These migrate upriver by the millions, growing, feeding, living in rivers and lakes for years before eventually swimming back to the Sargasso to spawn and die. Medieval Europe was full of them. Every river, every stream, every pond. Catching them was relatively easy. You could trap them in wicker baskets, net them in weirs, spear them at night when they came into shallows. Children could catch eels. Old men could catch eels. You didn't need specialized equipment or a noble permission like you did for deer or swans. Eels were common property available to anyone with minimal effort. This accessibility made them perfect for rent payments. A peasant with no cash, no surplus grain, no luxury goods could still catch eels. The Lord knew eels had value. They could be smoked, salted, sold in markets, shipped to cities. Accepting eel rents allowed lords to extract value from even the poorest tenants, while giving those tenants a way to pay that didn't require money. But delivering 4,000 eels was serious work. You couldn't catch them all in one day. Tenants had to eel fish throughout the year, storing their catch-keeping count. Some dug eel ponds to keep them alive until rent day. Others smoked or salted them, immediately preserving them until the annual reckoning. Eel weirs became property themselves, legally defined structures that controlled who could fish where. If you owned or controlled a good weir, you could generate serious income. Monasteries especially built elaborate eel-catching systems, traps, channels holding ponds. Some monasteries' entire economy pivoted on eels. They paid their own rents in eels, traded eels for goods, fed their monks eel constantly during fast days. Because yes, eels were fish, no theological gymnastics required. They lived in water, they had that fish-like form, they were unambiguously acceptable on Fridays and throughout Lent. This made them doubly valuable food that satisfied church law and functioned as currency simultaneously. Taste-wise, eels are rich, fatty, with firm flesh that's almost meaty. Smoked eel especially was prized, the smoking process concentrated. The fat-added complex flavours preserved the meat for months. Jellied eel, boiled eel, cooled until its natural gelatin sets. The broth became a London staple. Eel pie, eel stew, roasted eel, fried eel. Medieval cookbooks include dozens of eel recipes, but when you owed 4,000 eels as rent, you weren't eating many yourself. Those eels were currency, not dinner. You caught them, counted them, delivered them, and hoped you'd met the quota. Shortfalls could mean eviction fines, or worse. Eel rent wasn't negotiable. Historians still argue how the eel economy collapsed. Overfishing certainly played a role. As populations grew, eel catches declined. Pollution from growing cities fouled rivers. Weirs and dams disrupted eel migration. By the late medieval period, eels were less abundant, eel rents less common, the system shifting toward cash payments. But for centuries, eels swam through medieval life at every level. They connected peasant fishermen to distant markets. They filled monastery kitchens. They appeared at noble tables, poor tables, every table. They were background and foreground simultaneously, so common they were unremarkable, so valuable they formed economic bedrock. You're a tenant on a riverside manor. It's autumn, rent due in weeks. You've caught maybe 800 eels so far this year. You need 4,000. Every evening after fieldwork you check your traps hoping. 2 eels, 5 eels, 7. The count creeps upward. Your back aches. Your hands smell permanently of eel slime, that protective mucus coating that makes them impossible to grip, that stinks of river bottom and decay. You keep fishing. 3 nights before rent day, you hit 4,000. You exhale. You pen them in your holding pond count again to be sure. 4 ere 12. Good. Some might die before delivery. You need buffer. Rent day arrives. You and other tenants line up with barrels, baskets, squirming masses of eels. The bailiff counts checks. Your 4,000 are accepted. You're done for another year. The Lord Steward will sort these eels, some for the household, some for sale, some for the Lord's own rent obligations to his overlord. The eels will travel farther, change hands multiple times each transaction, binding people together in this strange economy of slithering currency. You walk home lighter, your obligation is met. Next week you'll fish for yourself, catch eels to eat, to smoke to trade for bread or ale. But tonight you're free of the count, free of the quota. The river flows past full of eels you don't owe anyone. You'll let them swim in peace. For tonight, let's shift from currency eels to something that kept entire villages from dying of thirst ale and the women who brewed it. Because here's what you need to understand about medieval beverages: water was suspect. Not always dangerous, but unreliable. You couldn't see bacteria. You couldn't know if the well was contaminated, if someone had dumped waste upstream, if the bucket had been cleaned. Water could kill you, and sometimes it did. Ale couldn't. The brewing process, boiling water, fermenting with yeast, the slight alcohol content made ale safer than water. Not sterile, not perfectly safe, but safer. This meant brewing wasn't optional luxury. It was survival infrastructure, and in most villages it was women's work. The Brewster female brewer was a fixture of medieval life. Not a specialist usually, not someone running a commercial operation, just a village woman who brewed for her household and sold the surplus. Most ale was consumed within days of brewing before it soured. This meant constant production. Brewsters brewed weekly, sometimes more often, creating the thin, low-alcohol small ale that everyone drank: children, adults, elderly, everyone. The process was straightforward but labour-intensive. You'd start with malted grain, usually barley, that had been soaked, sprouted, then dried in a kiln. This malting converted starches to sugars. You'd crush the malt, mix it with hot water in a large vat and let it steep. This created a sweet liquid called wort. The wort was then boiled, crucial for safety, sometimes with herbs for flavour. Hops weren't universal yet. Medieval ale often used groot, a mixture of herbs like bog myrtle, yarrow, heather, whatever grew locally and tasted good. Each region had its blend, each brewster her preference. After boiling, the wort cooled and yeast was added. Not commercial yeast, nobody understood yeast as microorganisms yet. You'd use the foam from a previous batch, or just expose the wort to air and hope wild yeast found it. Sometimes it worked beautifully, sometimes the batch spoiled. Brewing was part craft, part prayer. Fermentation took days. The liquid bubbled, developed alcohol transformed from sweet wort to sourish ale. When fermentation slowed, the ale was ready. You'd ladle it into jug cell or serve it immediately. It didn't keep. Within a week it had turned vinegary, undrinkable. Brewing was perpetual, and brewsters were crucial economic actors. A woman could support her family through ale sales. Widows especially used brewing as survival income. You didn't need land, didn't need capital beyond basic equipment, didn't need male family members, just grain, water, fuel, and knowledge. But brewing was also regulated, taxed, and watched. Because ale was essential, authorities controlled it. You needed permission to brew for sale. You paid taxes on production. Ale tasters, official inspectors checked quality, tested for watering down, enforced price controls. Get caught cheating and you'd face fines, public shaming, loss of brewing rights. The ale itself tasted nothing like modern beer. It was murky, yeasty, slightly sour, barely alcoholic, maybe 2 or 3%. You drank it for hydration as much as any mild buzz. A labourer might drink several quarts daily without getting noticeably drunk. Children drank weaker versions. Even babies got ale mixed with milk once weaned. This meant medieval people were technically slightly buzzed most of their waking hours. Not drunk, but not entirely sober either. That baseline alcohol consumption shaped medieval life in ways we can't fully appreciate. Did it make people more relaxed, more aggressive? Did constant mild intoxication influence decision-making, conflict resolution, religious experience? Historians still argue. What's certain is that ale was social glue. Brewing brought women income and status. Drinking bound communities together. The alehouse often, just a Brewster's cottage with a sign outside, was where news spread. Deals were made, disputes aired. Before coffee houses, before pubs as we know them, there were Brewster's homes full of neighbours drinking fresh ale and talking. Feast days saw stronger ale brewed with more malt allowed to ferment longer reaching maybe 6% alcohol. This strong ale was celebration drink, wedding drink, the stuff that actually got people drunk. But everyday small ale was maintenance hydration liquid bread. The phrase liquid bread was literal. Ale contained calories, B vitamins, nutrients from the grain. For peasants whose diet was grain-heavy anyway, ale supplemented food. A bowl of pottage and a quart of ale could sustain you through a day's labour. Not comfortably, but sustainably. You're in a village mid-afternoon, thirsty from field work. You head to the Brewster's cottage, the one with the ale stake, a pole with a bush or broom tied to the end, signalling fresh brew available. Inside the Brewster ladles ale from a barrel into your wooden cup. You pay a penny drink. It's cool-ish. She keeps the barrel in the shadiest corner, cloudy, slightly sour with an herbal undertone you can't quite identify. It doesn't taste like refreshment by modern standards. It tastes like safety. Like knowing this won't make you sick the way the stream water might. You drink deep, feel the mild alcohol settle into your empty stomach, softening the day's edges. Around you neighbours gather. Someone mentions the harvest. Someone else complains about their lord's new demands. The Brewster listens, pours, collects pennies. Her ale flows. Her household survives. Tomorrow she'll brew again. Next week again. Every week until she's too old to lift the grain sacks, and then her daughter will take over learning the craft, joining the long chain of women who kept medieval Europe hydrated, fed, and slightly drunk. You finish your cup, set it down, head back to work. The world is marginally softer now. The afternoon seems manageable. The ale worked. It always does. Tomorrow you'll be thirsty again. Tomorrow there'll be more ale. The cycle continues, eternal as the seasons. Now we arrive at something that defined daily eating more than any feast dish ever could, the pottage pot. That large cauldron hanging over the fire, never fully emptied, always being refilled, containing a thick stew that was breakfast, lunch and dinner for most medieval people most days of their lives. This wasn't a meal you planned. This was the meal, continuous, evolving, never quite the same, twice, never quite different either. The principle was simple. You had a pot iron if you were fortunate, ceramic if not. It hung from a hook over your hearth fire. Into it went whatever you had, grain, vegetables, scraps of meat, if you were lucky, water or broth, herb, salt, if you could afford it. You brought it to a boil, then let it simmer at the fire's edge for hours, sometimes all day. When mealtime came, you ladled out portions, eating it with bread for dipping, but you never emptied the pot completely. You'd leave some at the bottom, the thickened, deeply flavoured base, and add new ingredients to it. Water, more grain, yesterday's bread crusts, vegetable peelings. The pot never fully stopped, never fully started, it just continued. This wasn't laziness or primitive cooking, it was brilliance. That base layer cooking for days or weeks developed flavours no single day stew could match. The starches broke down, completely thickening the liquid. The fat from occasional meat enriched everything added afterward. Each ingredient contributed and absorbed, creating a flavour that was communal, accumulative, historical. The contents varied by season and fortune. Spring pottage might be thin vegetables, scarce, last year's grain running low. You'd stretch it with water, call it soup, pretend it was intentional. Summer brought abundance, peas, beans, greens, onions, leeks, everything green piling in. The pot became thick as porridge, almost solid, requiring a spoon that could stand upright. Autumn meant harvest additions. Fresh grain root vegetables the last of the garden produced before frost. If you'd slaughtered a pig for winter, scraps might find their way into the pot bits of fat organ pieces, bones for broth. The pottage turned rich, substantial, fortifying you for winter ahead. Winter was survival mode. The pot still hung, still simmered, but contents grew sparse. Dried peas or beans if you had them. Stored turnips, onions, stale bread, whatever remained. Some days it was barely more than grain porridge. Other days, if you'd trapped a rabbit or received charity, it improved, but it never stopped. Stopping meant restarting, and restarting wasted fuel time and that precious base flavour. The perpetual pot was also practical fuel management. Keeping one pot simmering used less wood than building fires for separate meals. You could bank the coals at night, add fuel in the morning, keep a low temperature going with minimal effort. In a world where gathering firewood was serious labour, this efficiency mattered. It also meant food was always ready. A labourer coming in from the fields didn't wait for dinner to cook. It was cooking had been cooking all day. You ladled, ate, left. A sick child could be fed immediately. An unexpected guest could be offered something. The pot provided, endlessly asking only that you remember to refill it. Historians still argue what perpetual pottage tasted like. Probably never bad, because off flavours would warn you the pot had gone wrong, souring, spoiling, and you'd dump it, clean it, start fresh. But probably never exceptional either. It was the flavour of continuity, of sameness, of sustaining rather than delighting. Social status showed in your pottage. A wealthy peasant might have pottage with regular meat scraps, good bread for thickening actual spices. A poor cottager had grain water, whatever vegetables they could beg, or forage no meat for months, but both had the pot, both kept it going. The pot was universal, democratizing the great equalizer. Some villages had communal pots, especially for the elderly, or widows who couldn't maintain their own fires. A neighbour might tend a pot that fed several households, each contributing what they could, each taking what they needed. This built community bonds more effectively than any law or sermon. You literally shared meals daily from the same source. The pot also held memory. That base layer wasn't just last week's food. It was last month's remnants of meals stretching back through time. You were eating history literally. The lamb bone from Easter still flavoured the pot in July. The harvest vegetables of September lingered into October. Your food had continuity, narrative connection to what came before. You're at your cottage hearth, evening falling. The pot hangs, as always, steam rising. You lift the lid, the wood is worn smooth from your hands, your mother's hands before you. How many hands before that? The contents bubble slowly. It's thick tonight, brownish grey flecked with green from the leeks you added this morning. You ladle a portion into your wooden bowl. It's hot, nearly scalding. You blow on it, sip carefully. The taste is familiar, not exciting, not disappointing. Just there. The grain is soft to dissolving. The vegetables have surrendered their shapes. Everything is one thing, now unified by time and heat. You tear bread, dip it, eat. The bread soaks up the thick liquid, becomes edible. Your stomach fills. The hunger that's been building since mid-afternoon fades. You finish, ladle a second portion. You'll eat until you're full tonight. Tomorrow might be leaner. Eat when you can. Before sleep you check the pot. Still warm. Still enough for morning. You add a dipper of water from the bucket, a handful of grain from the sack. Tomorrow's meal is already begun. You bank the fire coals glowing red under ash. The pot will simmer through the night, barely just enough. In the morning you'll stir it, add more fuel to the fire, bring it back to a gentle boil. You'll eat. Then you'll leave it simmering again, and it will wait for you, faithful as a dog, warm as a blanket, ready to feed you when you return. The pot never judges, never complains, just feeds endlessly, asking only that you feed it too. Now let's talk about something that makes the modern grocery bill seem reasonable: spices. Not just expensive, not just luxury. We're talking about commodities so valuable that a pound of saffron could buy you a horse. A handful of peppercorns could settle a debt. Cinnamon sticks were locked in strong boxes like jewellery. Spice wasn't flavouring, it was wealth in powder form status you could taste. The distances involved were staggering. Pepper came from India's Malabar coast, cinnamon from Ceylon, cloves from the Moluccas, tiny islands in what's now Indonesia. These spices travelled thousands of miles, changing hands dozens of times, each merchant taking a cut. By the time pepper reached a medieval European kitchen, it had crossed oceans, deserts, mountain ranges, and more customs houses than anyone could count. The markup was astronomical. Pepper that sold for pennies per pound at source cost shillings, sometimes pounds by the time it reached London or Paris, and people paid. Wealthy nobles hoarded spices. Merchants built fortunes trading them. Wars were fought over spice routes. The Venetians controlled Eastern Mediterranean trade and became rich beyond measure because they controlled the spice flow into Europe. But why were medieval Europeans obsessed with these exotic seasonings? The usual explanation is preservation spices mask the taste of rotting meat. This is mostly nonsense. Rich people who could afford spices could also afford fresh meat. They weren't disguising spoilage. They were displaying wealth. Spices signalled status as clearly as clothing or titles. If you served heavily spiced dishes, you were announcing, "I can afford pepper that costs as much as livestock." Your guests understood. Your rivals seethed. The spices themselves didn't need to improve the food, though they did often. They just needed to be there. Visible, expensive, impossible to ignore. Some dishes were more spice than food. Recipes survive, calling for ridiculous quantities: an entire ounce of saffron for one dish, multiple tablespoons of cinnamon pepper by the handful. These weren't meant to taste good by any reasonable standard. They were meant to overwhelm, to prove excess, to demonstrate that the host could afford to waste what others couldn't afford to use sparingly. Certain spices carried specific meanings. Saffron was the ultimate luxury, those tiny red threads harvested by hand from crocus flowers, requiring thousands of flowers to produce an ounce. Dishes coloured gold with saffron announced supreme wealth. Cinnamon suggested refinement, exotic connections. Pepper was classic, the standard by which other spices were measured. Ginger was medicinal, appropriate for delicate stomachs and the elderly. The humoral theory complicated everything. Remember, medieval medicine held that foods had inherent qualities: hot, cold, wet, dry. Spices were almost universally considered hot and dry, which meant they could balance cold, wet foods like fish. This wasn't just culinary preference. This was health management. You ate spices because they corrected your bodily humours, prevented illness, ensured digestion. This led to spice combinations that seem bizarre now. Fish swimming in sauce made from ginger, cinnamon, and pepper simultaneously. Chicken roasted with cloves. Wine spiced with cardamom and cube. Medieval cooks weren't going for subtle flavour balance. They were aggressively hot and dryifying everything, medical theory demanding it regardless of taste. But taste mattered too. People genuinely enjoyed these flavours, or learned to enjoy them because enjoying them signalled sophistication. Acquired taste is powerful. If everyone important loves pepper, you'll learn to love pepper or fake it convincingly. Medieval palates were trained from childhood on these aggressive spice profiles. They probably couldn't imagine food without them the way we can't imagine coffee without caffeine. Merchants stored spices like treasure. Locked rooms, guards, careful measuring. A cook requesting spices from the household stores didn't just take what they needed. It was measured out, recorded the cook accountable for every grain. Stealing spices was serious crime. Servants were whipped, sometimes branded for pocketing peppercorns. Lower classes had their own spice substitutes, local herbs that approximated expensive imports. Mustard instead of pepper, horseradish for heat, wild garlic. These weren't the same, didn't carry the same status, but they made food interesting, made bland pottage tolerable. The desire for flavour crossed class boundaries even if access didn't. Trade wars erupted over spices. Portugal sought direct routes to the Indies to bypass Venetian middlemen. Spain funded Columbus, hoping he'd find a western spice route. He didn't, but stumbled on a continent instead. The desire for cheaper pepper literally redrew world maps. Connected continents launched the age of exploration. Spices changed history. You're at a lord's feast, relatively minor nobility but wealthy enough to impress. Tonight's centerpiece is a lamprey pie. Remember those blood-sucking eels, but the real show is the sauce. The cook appears carrying a small locked box. The steward opens it with a key worn on his belt. Inside spices. The cook measures carefully, saffron threads counted. Cinnamon bark weighed. Peppercorns exactly 30. Ginger root a thumb-length piece. The steward watches, records quantities in a ledger. This is ceremony as much as cooking. Everyone sees the spices. Everyone understands their value. The sauce is prepared tableside ingredients crushed in a mortar, mixed with wine heated in a small pan over a spirit lamp. The smell is overwhelming, pungent, sweet, sharp, foreign. It smells like money. The sauce is drizzled over the lamprey pie. Gold threads of saffron swim in dark liquid. Cinnamon specks float like wood shavings on water. You're served a portion. The spice hits your tongue immediately, heat from pepper sweetness, from cinnamon, that indefinable saffron flavour that's somehow worth a horse. The lamprey beneath is almost secondary. You're eating the sauce, you're eating cost. Each bite is someone's monthly wages. You chew slowly, trying to seem appreciative rather than overwhelmed. This is too much spice for any reasonable palate. But reasonable isn't the point. Impressed is the point. Remembered is the point. You'll tell people about this meal, this sauce, these spices. The Lord will have succeeded. His wealth will be confirmed, discussed, envied. You swallow. Your mouth burns gently. Your host smiles. Let's talk about something that sounds like a typo, but was actually a kitchen staple verjuice. Not vinegar, though close. Not wine, though related. Verjuice was the sour juice of unripe grapes, and it was everywhere in medieval cooking, cutting through fat, brightening flavours, preserving foods, doing all the work that lemon juice or vinegar does now, but with its own particular sharp green unripe character. The name tells you everything. Verjuice from the French, vert juice, literally green juice, a You made it by pressing unripe grapes, the ones that would never ripen properly, the clusters that got shaded out or grew on weak vines. These grapes were mouth-puckeringly sour, inedible as fruit, useless for wine. But pressed and bottled, they became liquid gold for cooks. The process was simple. Harvest the green grapes in early summer before veraison, when they'd begin to sweeten and colour. Crush them stems, seeds, skins, everything. Press out the juice, bottle it in sealed containers. That's it. The high acidity prevented spoilage without fermentation. Verjuice could keep for months, providing sourness year-round when fresh citrus was impossible, and vinegar was sometimes too harsh. Medieval recipes call for verjuice constantly. Sauce for roasted meats, verjuice herbs and breadcrumbs. Dressing for salads, verjuice and oil. Deglazing agent for pan sauces. Base for marinades. preservative for fruits and vegetables. It did everything. And unlike vinegar, which could be aggressively acidic and one-note verjuice had complexity, fruity tart, slightly green tasting with subtle sweetness underneath the sour. It also fit the humoral framework perfectly. Verjuice was considered cold and dry, making it the ideal partner for hot moist meats like pork and duck. Medical texts recommended it for digestion, for cooling overheated bodies, for balancing rich foods. Using verjuice wasn't just culinary, it was therapeutic preventive medicine disguised as sauce. Different regions made variations. Some added herbs during pressing sorrel, mint, parsley, infusing the juice with additional flavors. Some used crab apples instead of grapes, creating a different but similarly tart liquid. In regions without vineyards, any sour unripe fruit could become verjuice in spirit, if not in name. Unripe plums, gooseberries, even sorrel leaves crushed and strained. Verjuice was also economical. Grapes that would otherwise be waste became valuable product. Vineyards with poor-performing sections could salvage something. Households with a few grapevines could produce enough verjuice for their annual needs from the unripe clusters alone, saving the good grapes for eating or wine. The taste was distinctive. Not as sharp as vinegar, not as acidic as lemon juice, but somewhere between a gentler, rounder sourness with fruity undertones. In rich medieval dishes heavy with fat and meat, verjuice provided necessary balance, brightening everything without overwhelming it. Modern chefs who've recreated medieval recipes using verjuice report that it transforms dishes, making them lighter, more complex, more palatable than vinegar-based versions. But verjuice faded from use as citrus, became more accessible, and as taste preferences shifted towards sweeter, less aggressively sour profiles. By the Renaissance it was declining. By the modern era it had nearly vanished, remembered only in historical cookbooks and the occasional artisan producer, making it for culinary historians and experimental chefs. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually liked all that sourness, or simply tolerated it because it was available and medically recommended. Contemporary sources don't complain about it, which suggests acceptance if not enthusiasm. Probably as with most tastes, it was acquired, normalized, expected. You grew up with verjuice-sourced meats, and that became what meat should taste like. The seasonal aspect mattered too. Verjuice appeared in early summer when fresh sourness was welcome, after winter's preserved heavy foods. That timing, new bright green, made it psychologically appealing beyond just its flavor. It tasted like renewal, like the garden coming back, like winter finally ending. Some monasteries produced verjuice commercially, selling it alongside their wine and vinegar. Quality varied. Good verjuice was pressed from specific grape varieties at exactly the right unripeness, strained carefully, bottled clean. Poor verjuice was muddy, inconsistent, sometimes infected with wild yeasts that started unwanted fermentation. But even mediocre verjuice beat no sourness at all. You're in a medieval kitchen midsummer. The cook has just roasted a duck, rich, fatty, the skin crackling. Now comes the sauce. She reaches for the stone bottle of verjuice, pours a generous amount into a pan with the duck drippings. It sizzles, steams, the sharp smell cutting through the rich duck smell. She adds chopped sage from the garden, a pinch of salt lets it reduce slightly. The liquid is pale, greenish-yellow, cloudy with grape particles. She tastes, nods, pours the sauce over the carved duck. The contrast is immediate. The verjuice cuts the fattiness, the acidity balancing the rich meat, the herbal notes lifting everything. You're served a portion. The first bite surprises you. You expected the meat's richness to dominate, but the sauce is there equally tart and bright. The duck doesn't feel heavy despite its fat. The verjuice has lightened, it made it almost refreshing. You taste the unripe grapes, that green sharp quality that's nothing like wine or vinegar, but somehow better with this particular meat. You finish your portion quickly. The acidity stimulates your appetite rather than satisfying it. You want more? The cook smiles. That's the point of verjuice. It doesn't fill you, it opens you, prepares your palate for the next course, keeps the feast moving. Outside, green grapes hang in clusters weeks from ripeness. Some will mature into wine grapes, but some, the shaded ones, the weak ones, will be pressed. Green will become next year's verjuice, will sauce next summer's duck. Nothing wasted, everything used. Summer captured in bottles, waiting to brighten winter meals. Now we need to discuss something that sounds impossibly strange until you see it in action: bread trenchers. Not plates made of bread. Actual bread functioning as plates, thick slabs of stale bread that you ate from, that absorbed your meal's grease and juices, that became progressively more delicious as dinner progressed, and that were then either eaten themselves or given to the poor. This was standard dining technology, and it solved multiple problems simultaneously. First, understand that metal plates were expensive. Ceramic plates were fragile, required skilled potters, broke easily. Wood plates needed carving, maintenance, storage space. For a feast feeding dozens or hundreds of people, providing individual plates was a logistical nightmare and significant expense. But bread, every household made bread. Every manor had bakeries producing loaves daily. Bread was everywhere cheap, and when it went stale after a day or two, it became perfect trencher material. The trenchers were cut thick, maybe an inch, sometimes more, from large coarse loaves, not your delicate white bread. This was dense, heavy bread made from whole grain flour, sometimes mixed with beans or other fillers. It was meant to be structural, not necessarily tasty. Though not tasty is relative fresh, it was perfectly edible, just plain. Stale, it became too hard to chew comfortably, but gained the firmness needed to support wet, heavy foods. You'd place the trencher in front of each diner, sometimes directly on the table, sometimes on a wooden board. Then food was served onto the bread, meat with sauce, stewed vegetables, fish in gravy. Everything liquid heavy that would normally pool on a plate instead soaked into the bread, which gradually transformed from hard slab to gravy-saturated deliciousness. During the meal you'd eat from the trencher, but not necessarily eat the trencher itself, at least not at first. You'd cut your meat fish or whatever, letting juices drip down. You might tear pieces from the trencher's edges to use as pushers or spoons, but the base remained growing heavier, softer, more flavourful with every course. At meal's end you had options. The wealthy often didn't eat their trenchers. They were full from the meal itself, and the bread, now soaked with grease sauce and meat juices, was beneath their dignity, despite being delicious. These used trenchers were collected and distributed to the poor gathered at the gate. This was expected charity. The trenchers represented significant food value, and giving them away demonstrated both generosity and proper social hierarchy. For less wealthy diners or for those at the lower tables, the trencher was part of the meal. You ate it eagerly, this bread that now tasted of everything served upon it. It was often the best part, concentrated flavours, satisfying texture, no waste. Some diners apparently saved their trenchers for last, treating them as a final course, a savoury dessert. The poor who received trenchers from feasts weren't receiving scraps exactly. They were receiving legitimate food bread plus the absorbed richness of meat juices, fats, sauces. For someone living on thin pottage and old bread, a trencher from a noble feast was luxurious, providing protein and fat they'd otherwise never taste. This system also meant no dishes to wash. The trenchers were either eaten or given away. The wooden boards beneath them, if used, needed only a quick wipe. Compare this to washing dozens of metal or ceramic plates requiring hot water soap labour and somewhere to dry everything. Trenches eliminated all that. Different foods required different trencher management. Very wet foods like stews needed especially thick trenchers, or the bread would disintegrate, collapsing into the meal. Dry foods like roasted meat worked on thinner trenchers. Experienced diners knew to eat strategically, consuming wetter portions first, while the trencher was still firm, saving drier foods for later when structural integrity was compromised. Some trenchers were flavoured. Bakers might add herbs to the dough, rosemary, thyme, so the bread itself contributed taste. Or they'd brush the surface with fat before serving, giving it preliminary richness. These upgraded trenchers appeared at better tables, another way of signalling status through food presentation. Historians still argue how universal trenchers were. They dominate the feast records, clearly standard for large gatherings. But did everyday household meals use them? Probably less often. For a family of 4, eating pottage wooden bowls made more sense. But for any meal with meat and sauce, trenchers were practical, especially when serving multiple people. The practice declined as plates became cheaper and more available. Pewter plates spread among the middle class. Ceramic improved in quality and affordability. By the late medieval period, trenchers were becoming old-fashioned, associated with earlier, rougher times. By the Renaissance, they were mostly gone, replaced by permanent tableware. But for centuries they'd been the standard, the normal, the way people ate. You're at a feast, seated at a lower table. A servant places your trencher before you, thick, square, slightly stale-smelling. It looks unappetizing. Then the food arrives. Roasted pork with onion sauce, ladled directly onto your bread plate. The sauce immediately begins soaking in, darkening the bread, softening it. You eat the meat first, cutting pieces, savouring the fat and seasoning. Each cut releases more juice. The trencher darkens further. By the third course, fish and almond milk sauce, your trencher is approaching saturation. The bread almost falling apart, but not quite. Finally the meal ends. You look at your trencher. It's soggy brown-grey with absorbed sauces, fragrant with everything you've eaten. You're still hungry, you're always still hungry. You pick up the trencher, bite in. It's extraordinary. Dense and soft and rich, tasting of meat and fish and spices and sauce all at once. It's better than anything that was served on it because it's everything combined. You eat the entire thing, licking your fingers after wishing for more. Above you at the high table, servants collect uneaten trenchers, pile them in baskets. Those will go to the poor at the gate. You're grateful you got to eat yours. Tomorrow you'll be hungry again. Tonight you're full. The bread did its job, held your meal, became your meal, satisfied completely. Now we arrive at one of the stranger theological gymnastics in medieval dining, the category bending of animals during Lent. We touched on porpoises and beavers earlier, but let's dig deeper into the beautiful absurdity of how medieval people convinced themselves that certain warm-blooded, air-breathing, obviously not fish creatures were in fact fish. Because the rules said no meat during fasting, and the loopholes said everything aquatic was fish, and human ingenuity said, let's get creative. The beaver tail situation deserves another look. The reasoning went like this. Beavers spend most of their time in water. They swim. They have that flat, scaly-looking tail. Therefore, and this is where the logic takes a running leap, the tail is fish. Not the beaver, just the tail. The rest of the beaver, furry and four-legged and undeniably mammalian, remained meat forbidden off limits. But that tail fair game every Friday. This created a bizarre market for beaver tail specifically. Trappers in regions with beaver populations would sometimes discard the body and preserve only the tail for sale during Lent. The tail itself is mostly fat, making it rich and sustaining, but also intensely flavoured musky. Strong, definitely an acquired taste. Recipes called for extensive preparation, boiling, soaking, boiling again to make it palatable. Then there were barnacle geese. Medieval bestiaries, those illustrated books describing animals real and imaginary, insisted that barnacle geese didn't hatch from eggs like normal birds. Instead, they grew from barnacles attached to driftwood. The barnacles would mature, split open, and out would fly fully formed geese. Since they came from the sea, they were clearly fish, not fowl, and therefore permitted during Lent. This wasn't fringe belief. Respectable authorities repeated it. Scholars wrote about it. And conveniently, it meant that goose meat normally forbidden became acceptable fasting food. Some Irish and Scottish monasteries apparently ate barnacle goose throughout Lent without qualm. Eventually, church authorities caught on and specifically forbade the practice, but the fact that they had to forbid it tells you it was happening. Puffins fell into similar ambiguity. These seabirds spend so much time on water diving for fish that some argued they were of the sea and therefore fish-like enough for Lent. Puffin meat is oily, fishy tasting from their diet, which probably helped the argument. Coastal communities in Iceland, the Faroe Islands and northern Scotland ate puffin during fasting periods, and apparently nobody objected too strenuously. Water voles, small rodents living near streams, got the fish treatment in some regions. The reasoning was identical to beavers' lives in water, therefore aquatic, therefore fish. This seems to have been more localized, not widespread, but it appears in enough sources to suggest it was genuine practice, not just theoretical possibility. Even certain aquatic plants got special dispensation. Watercress growing in streams was sometimes treated as more acceptable during strict fasting than land vegetables. This makes some sense, it did come from water. But the reasoning became circular quickly. Everything associated with water becomes aquatic. Everything aquatic becomes acceptable. Therefore, we can eat almost anything if we squint hard enough. The underlying issue was practical. Genuine fish, cod, herring, whatever swam in rivers and seas got boring fast. Eating fish every Friday throughout Lent during Advent on various saints' days added up to significant dietary monotony. People wanted variety. The church wanted obedience, but also realistic rules people would follow. Loopholes emerged not as rebellion, but as negotiation between divine law and human appetite. Historians still argue whether church authorities genuinely believed the barnacle goose stories or simply look the other way. Probably both. Medieval people could hold contradictory beliefs simultaneously, knowing that barnacle geese hatched from eggs like other birds, while also accepting that bestiaries said they came from barnacles. The exact biological truth mattered less than the category was it meat or not meat. The answer was theological, not zoological. These loopholes also highlight how food classifications were cultural constructs, not natural facts. A beaver tail isn't inherently different from beaver leg, same animal, same biology. But culture said one was fish, and one was meat, and that cultural decision became real through practice, repetition, authority. We do the same today with different categories, different boundaries equally arbitrary when examined closely. The practice also shows medieval pragmatism. Given the choice between impossible rules that everyone breaks or flexible rules that everyone follows, the church chose flexibility. Better to allow beaver tail and maintain overall fasting compliance than forbid everything and watch people abandon fasting entirely. The loopholes were pressure valves preventing the system from exploding. You're in a monastery refectory Lent Friday. The meal arrives fish soup as expected, but also a platter of something else. Dark fatty pieces in sauce. The brother next to you sees your confusion. Beaver tail, he whispers. Permitted, it's from water. You take a piece. It's rich, almost overwhelming, definitely not fish in any conventional sense. It tastes like very strong, very fatty meat. Your mind says this is wrong. The calendar says it's Lent. Your stomach says it doesn't care. This is the most substantial thing you've eaten in weeks. You chew, swallow. Around you, brothers eat their portions without comment. This is normal here. Permitted. The beaver lived in water, therefore this is water food, therefore it's acceptable. The reasoning is absurd, but also officially sanctioned. You take another piece. Later you'll rationalize it. You'll remember the beaver's aquatic life, its swimming, its tail's scaly appearance. You'll convince yourself this really is different from meat. Or you won't convince yourself, but you'll eat it anyway because the abbot said it's permitted, and you're hungry, and Lent is long, and sometimes theological flexibility tastes better than theological purity. The platter empties. Tomorrow will be fish again. But tonight the beaver tail sustained you, the loophole fed you, the absurdity made life bearable. We've travelled through strange meals and stranger reasoning through eels as currency, and birds in pies through perpetual pottage and bread plates through every loophole and delicacy the medieval kitchen could conjure. Now as our feast ends and the candles burn low, let's gather these scattered courses into something whole, the understanding of what medieval eating really meant. Because here's what all these meals share. They weren't just food. They were survival strategies, social statements, theological negotiations, economic transactions, and communal rituals all rolled into one. The peacock redressed in its feathers wasn't dinner, it was power made visible. The eel rent wasn't payment, it was the binding tie between tenant and lord. The perpetual pottage wasn't a recipe, it was continuity itself, yesterday flowing into today, flowing into tomorrow. Medieval people didn't eat for pleasure alone, though pleasure certainly existed. They ate to stay alive in a world that made staying alive difficult. They ate to signal status in a rigidly hierarchical society. They ate to comply with church law that governed a third of their days. They ate to balance humours their physicians insisted needed balancing. Every meal carried weight beyond its ingredients. The strange foods we've explored, dormice hedgehogs, lamprey, cockentress, weren't strange to them. They were normal, practical, or appropriately impressive depending on context. What seems bizarre to us made perfect sense within their framework. A sewn-together pig chicken demonstrated mastery over creation. A perpetual pot demonstrated efficient resource use. Beaver tail as fish demonstrated theological flexibility. Each was rational within its system, and the systems were complex, overlapping, sometimes contradictory. You had to navigate religious law, humoral theory, seasonal availability, social hierarchy, and simple hunger simultaneously. The medieval diner was constantly calculating, is this permitted today? Will this balance my humours? Can I afford this? What does serving this say about me? What does accepting this say about my host? The tastes themselves were probably acquired but genuinely enjoyed. That aggressive spicing, that ever-present sourness from verjuice, that richness from constant animal fat, these weren't tolerated, they were preferred. Palates adapt. What starts as strange becomes normal, then beloved. Medieval people probably couldn't imagine our bland, underspiced modern meals any more than we can imagine their pepper-heavy sauces. The social function of meals was paramount. Eating together created and reinforced bonds. The boar's head ceremony united the hall in song. Distributing trenchers to the poor fulfilled charity obligations. Sharing the perpetual pot built neighbourhood networks. Even the feast where you served impossible foods created memories, stories, relationships that outlasted the indigestion. Class differences showed in every bite, but so did surprising equality. Noble and peasant both kept perpetual pots, just with different contents. Both drank ale, just different strengths. Both dealt with the same church fasting laws, just with different loopholes available. The framework was shared even when the specifics varied enormously, and waste was minimal. The deer became venison for nobles, humble pie for servants, bones for dogs, nothing discarded. The hedgehog was caught, cooked in its own clay oven, eaten completely. Even the bird pie's birds were released or kept, not killed pointlessly. When resources were scarce, efficiency was survival, and efficiency meant using everything, wasting nothing, finding value in what we'd now discard. The meals also marked time's seasonal rhythms, visible on every table. Spring brought thin pottage and fresh verjuice. Summer offered abundant vegetables for the pot. Autumn meant harvest plenty and boar hunts. Winter demanded preserved foods, smoked eels, the Christmas boar's head marking solstice survival. You could navigate the year by what you ate each season, tasting different each with its appropriate foods. Looking back across these 20 sections, these strange meals, what emerges isn't alien practices but human ingenuity. People solving problems with available tools, making rules flexible enough to follow, finding pleasure in difficult circumstances, building community through shared meals, surviving winter fasting, poverty, hierarchy and disease by being clever, adaptable, occasionally absurd and always resourceful. The medieval table wasn't a place of abundance by our standards. It was often a place of making do, of stretching resources, of accepting what was possible, rather than imagining what was ideal. But it was also where families gathered, where communities formed, where rituals happened, where life was sustained day after day, meal after meal, bite after bite. The strange foods, the dormice and peacocks and cockentriques, were exceptional, memorable, because they were rare. Most medieval meals were perpetual pottage and dark bread and weak ale, and whatever could be caught or grown or preserved. Humble food eaten by humble people, unremarked and unrecorded, but absolutely central to how life continued. Those meals don't appear in feast records or cookbooks. They weren't photographed or painted, but they fed millions across centuries, kept bodies alive and souls together, and in their quiet, unremarkable way, they were the real story of medieval eating. Not the spectacle meals we've explored tonight, but the everyday bread, the always simmering pot, the shared cup of ale in a neighbour's cottage. Both mattered. The feast showed what was possible at the heights. The everyday showed what was necessary at the foundation, and between them they kept medieval Europe fed imperfectly, often barely, sometimes brilliantly, but ultimately successfully enough, that we're here descendants of people who ate hedgehogs and eel pie and perpetual pottage and somehow thrived. The great hall grows quiet now. The last trenches have been cleared. The subtleties have been admired and distributed. The fire in the hearth burns lower, coals glowing red beneath ash, just like that perpetual pot we talked about, never quite out, never quite blazing, just continuing. Outside these walls, in cottages across the medieval landscape, other fires glow, other pots simmer, other families break bread together, or drink ale together, or simply sit together in the small warmth they've managed to create against the cold and dark. The meals we've explored tonight, strange as they were elaborate or simple, expensive or free, all serve the same ultimate purpose. They kept people alive. They brought people together. They marked time passing and seasons changing. They turned survival into something more than just surviving. That's what food does, really. Whether it's a gilded peacock or grain porridge, whether it's eaten from silver platters or soaked into bread trenchers, whether it costs a fortune in spices or nothing but time and firewood, food is how we stay, how we endure, how we remember we're human together, trying our best with what we have. The medieval world is gone now, those kitchens cold, those fires long extinguished. But the echoes remain in our phrases like humble pie, in our love of feasts and gathering in that deep satisfaction of a meal shared with people we care about. Some things don't change, not really, not across centuries. So let's leave this table now, this strange medieval feast with all its peculiarities and delights. Let's let the candles gutter and the fire dim. Tomorrow will bring its own meals, its own hungers, its own ways of satisfying them. But tonight we've feasted on history, on strangeness, on the endless ingenuity of people trying to eat well in a difficult world. Rest easy. Dream of simpler meals. The pot will still be simmering in the morning. The story ends here. See you in the next video. Good night.